problematic anyway because they have overcrowding in the prisons in whatever San Bruno or wherever the hell the jail is. Oh, ready to go. All righty. Welcome to This and That. Thank you for showing up. Uh, Yesterday we looked at Evgeny Pashakunis, the Marxist legal scholar who was purged during the Stalinist period. It sounds pretty tedious on the one hand. On the other hand, he's sort of the guy who, if you're going to make Marxist law, that he was following it somewhat slavishly, but Marx and the commodity form were important. And it's still worthwhile talking about, at least the segments where he's talking about exchange value, et cetera. Well, at least to me it is. Of course, he got rehabilitated after the 1956 uh, Khrushchev speech, like a lot of other people. So you can see that Stalinism was a real problem between the years 19 whatever 37, 39 to 1956. I know that may seem not very important, but a lot of things happened. The invasion of Hungary, then the subsequent invasion of Czechoslovakia, et cetera, et cetera. So in commie history, that a lot of stuff happened, and of course there was the war itself. Today, because in the class unity course on Sunday, and I missed it last week, and they don't record it, so I don't know what the hell happened. So it'd be nice if someone would clue us in if you attended class unity on Sunday. Why didn't I attend it? I can't remember. I was having an anxiety attack or something. I was sleeping. That's what I was. I was
Yeah, you,
sleeping.
you were sawing logs.
That's right. I didn't show up and I didn't wake up until five something. Anyway, I woke up sort of in time for Star Trek. Anyway, and speaking of which, we will have Star Trek again this coming weekend for those for whom it matters, I assume. Anyway, uh, because Class Unity is using the works of Michael Hudson, who is a major light in uh, modern money theory, I thought that it would be useful to look at and I've read from Michael Hudson's work before, but I think people didn't get a real sense of how important he is. He's one of the guys. Mosler, Michael Hudson, Stephanie Kelton, et cetera, are Randy Ray, et cetera, are the major
Hunter Levins,
lights of yes. Uh,
yeah. Bill
of
Mitchell.
modern money, indeed, modern money theory. So, Michael Hudson, useful and more interesting for the usual kinds of liberal arts reasons. I mean, he was a music guy as an undergraduate, and then because he was a Trotskyist, ultimately winds up in economics, which is all very interesting and even more interesting from a political point of view. He spends a lot of years working in the kind of financial bureaucracy. Chase, I think, a variety of other.
Yeah,
He had,
he
money
was
jobs.
yeah, he was at Chase for in the chief economist's office. They made really good money back then.
So
Sorry to I talked to Hudson at
no, no.
at the People's Forum, and he is really
Cool.
brilliant. But at the same
Oh
time,
yes,
he
indeed he
still
is.
says he was still going on about we live in a fossil fueled economy. Um, so
Oh yeah, yeah. He has a apocalyptic kind of a
oh
view
yeah,
of the world. It's very Marxist in that sense. He does consider himself a Marxist. I'm going to read from the Wikipedia coverage slightly. The book, I uploaded a copy of it to the files section in Discord, and that is, it's a counterpunch, a freely available book. His 2015 book, Michael Hudson, Killing the Host, How Financial Parasites and Debt Bondage Destroy the Global Economy. That's pretty much the whole story when you get right down to it. I included the audiobook version of it, I think. And so I think it's only the first part of it, but it's 8 hours of audio, I think. You may want to avail yourself of that. I also included the PDF as well to try to make this accessible. We're not going to read the whole book, or unless people want to. I figured I would use the intro, the sort of 12, and read and talk about the 12 themes of this particular book. Now, the reason why I chose this book, aside from its position in his sort of bibliography or in his CV, is because it's maybe a little less apocalyptic and more technical. But yes, this is the popularized version of his earlier book. So this is the easy one to read, and I would hope that people would be interested in reading it. It's not very technical. Can't recall whether there are equations. So there are no equations, no algebra. So it should be easier for folks. And the deal with Hudson is, of course, because of his, and I would say this is from Trotsky, his Trotsky position, I suppose, is that you really do need to get down on into the way the entire global system works, which includes issues of loans, mortgages, interest payments, and external debt. And then to focus on what Marx looks at in volumes. You see, there's still relevance here, volumes 2 and 3, which, if you're looking at the class unity syllabus, that's, this has a lot of, it is consonance with um, Michael Hudson's work as well, and the MMT folks. So there's this underlying idea here. And Hudson was all about debt, and I've uploaded into the files section a complete copy of Graeber's book on 5,000 Years of Debt or whatever. And I would hope that we might start reading that, in a gentle sort of way, considering that it's 500 some odd pages. So I hope that people will be interested in that. Hudson is interesting because, he starts looking at the problem, and I think it's a kind of encouragement. Well, the introduction of the book talks about his issues with economics departments, particularly the New School, and his sort of I think he wasn't happy with Robert Heilbronner. And yes, Heilbronner himself is, well, I suppose he could be a Marxist. I think he was probably a social democrat, but a decent historian. Anyway, the point is that Hudson's research is in areas that aren't covered by the conventional curriculum, and so he explains how he's essentially has come to a kind of heterodox sort of position. Partially because they hired him in the international division at or for international trade, and as you perhaps may know, there's a whole international section of the New School that is not the same as the more Marxist graduate faculty. And so they hired him to teach that stuff. And it was just interesting that he shifted his research and sort of applied it in a much more global way. And as any good Trotskyist internationalist, he engaged, the entire financial system. And so Hudson identifies himself as a Marxist. But his interpretation of Karl Marx is different from some other Marxists. For example, Stalin's popularization of Volume 1 of Capital to say capitalism is an exploitation of workers by their employers, all that indeed was in Volume 1, but Marx wrote Volume 2 and Volume 3 all about finance and rent seeking. And that's kind of the things that I'm amused by. And so I don't know if I want to read this whole thing. You can read it. The issue is, of course, the idea that uh, finance capitalism of the variety begun that Marx begins to talk about in Volume 2 and Volume 3 is the kind of key component, particularly at the end of the 19th century. And so the idea of extracting economic rent rather than formation of industry, I mean, both are going on at the same time. And the point is that the financial sector is probably even more important, considering all of the panics and crisis and manipulating stuff, and of course the usual imperialism. So all of those things are part of this. Labor is increasingly exploited by bank debt, student debt, and credit card debt, while housing and other prices are inflated on credit. This is that time lag that I've been talking about before, leaving less income to spend on goods and services as economies suffer debt deflation. This is the issue, and the one covered partially by the discussion. We're trying to watch The Big Short, but we didn't. But those are the same kinds of issues. And Hudson argues that Marx was too optimistic. This is a kind of position on the issue of historical materialism, whether it's there's a clear, through line in the sense. And what you have to do ultimately is look at the structural things and from a Trotskyist point of view, there is a concern for the logic and the structure of all of these matters. I'm not tarring him as a Trotskyist. I'm just saying that his own background has made him relatively, as it were, quiet about his own leftward leanings. And so, on the one hand, he gets amplified because he was able to predict the 2008 crash, which only a handful of economists did, and Rubini is probably the most famous of all of those people who could predict the crash. But the reality, of course, is one of the transition between the move from feudalism to capitalism, and currently we are in this kind of neo-feudal situation. And so rents are important. And so there's a little thing in here from Wikipedia on volumes 2 and 3. And you can see that 2 and 3 become important when we start thinking about developed countries. So now to start the first chapter of the book, he gives his own biography. It's very diaristic in that sense, and I appreciate that. He talks about his time at NYU, his being hired by the New School, that he never taken a course in international trade and finance, so he sort of wanted to do this. And the fact is, he had all this experience in working, for Wall Street. So the point that he's making is that the academic analysis is not identical to reality, and so you have to sort of the nuances, I think, are ones generated by stuff that happens in everyday, transactions and stuff like that. So I found academic theory to be the reverse of how the world actually works. None of my professors had enough real world experience in banking or Wall Street to notice. It's a big problem. My issue in graduate schools, my professors, while they were really good at the kind of regulatory framework and all of the sort of quasi-legal sort of stuff, the reality is that they weren't quite smart enough about the details of how telecommunications networks operate. But anyway, that's another thing. So I spent 3 years at the New School developing an analysis of why the global economy is polarizing rather than converging. I found that mercantilist economic theories already in the 18th century were ahead of today's mainstream in many ways. This is this thing where, that he learned a lot looking at debt by studying, Babylonian economics and debt and credit structures in pre-modern societies, which is actually a really interesting issue or problem that's similar to my little trope talking about Italian banks. Um, that that all the structures are there, and usury is not just something you just sort of pass off. It's a much more complicated structure. And I appreciate the fact that Hudson was interested in this because it is a credit debt structure, that because of the formation of how, as it were, money operates, or how capital operates, or pre-capital capital operates. So it all fits the kind of interests that of the time, that is, pre-capitalist formation stuff, primitive accumulation. All of those things are really interesting, and and often you need that kind of background in order to sort of get a better appreciation of how settler colonialism operates. For example, my warning that third world countries would not be able to pay their debts disturbed the department's chairman, Bob Heilbronner, finding the idea unthinkable. He complained that my emphasis on financial overhead was distracting students from the key form of exploitation, that of wage labor by its employers. And I've seen this quote a whole bunch of places, and it's sort of amusing. But the reality is that he covers all of the big books that he's done, and these were all good and influential books from a liberal point of view, necessary in terms of the large thing. But it is a kind of, what was fascinating is that he was looking at the history of debt crises and going all the way back to the classical period, that is, classical Greece and Rome, and this whole idea of a jubilee year to that the jubilee year is a kind of, it works into um, the theological element in Christianity of forgiveness, and this the idea of forgiveness is actually really an interesting component of that notion relative to other forms of credit debt. Uh, you know, um, I suppose it has a similarity to bank holidays, but not really. But then again, and then he goes back to this other stuff, and that's all interesting stuff. I mean, in fact, what he's looking at, and it's not so much the historical elements, but the fact is that behavior, the human behavior, pre-modern human behavior, is kind of metabolic in that sense, to without getting too far into the sort of new approaches to including Marx. But I did find that his first chapter, or if this is the preface, has some interesting observations, and the whole idea of parasites is actually sort of an interesting kind of trope to develop here, because of the way how parasites operate. So I think he does an interesting explication of how parasites operate in insects, for example, and yet there is a kind of relation that you can draw, however analogous, however metaphorical you want to get about it. But this sort of trope that goes through this particular book is actually quite useful to give oneself a sense of how debt and credit operate as parasitic elements, in a variety of kinds of ways. So it's just I've just found it interesting reading, and the idea of financial management, et cetera, and kind of his feeling about his position relative to not only Marx but the Austrians, et cetera. Mentions Graeber's debt, the first 5,000 years, and I think perhaps we should read that. We managed to we managed to survive Brad DeLong, so I figure we can survive Graeber. In the early 1990s, I had tried to write my own summary, but was unable to convince publishers that the Near Eastern tradition of biblical debt cancellation was firmly grounded. uh, That's kind of like an epitaph. But anyway, 2 decades ago, economic historians and even many biblical scholars thought that the Jubilee year was merely a literary creation, a utopian escape from practical reality. I encountered a wall of cognitive dissonance at the thought that the practice was attested to in increasingly detailed clean slate proclamations. So, so there's an interesting history of this, and he goes through this idea of uh, canceling debts or sort of liberating it in order to um, sort of start again. It's a kind of um, reset, as it were, for the economy to think not so much in absolute but in more relative terms and the success of it, and also to think of it in more natural terms. That is, that nature is not so quite so absolute, even though it does have certain absolute elements in it. It evolves, and it evolves with, on the one hand, finality from a mortal kind of point of view, but as a kind of system, it continues on. So this difference is actually really interesting and is one of the ways in which you can talk about modern money theory. Which is problematic from a policy position and a bunch of other reasons why it occurs, but it's still worth talking about, and particularly in policy development. So anyway, so he talks about other kind of stuff, the problems of mainstream economics. Come on, stop. This pattern of debt as unproductive. And the difference between productive and unproductive elements, I think, are really important. This idea of sort of, if you want to think about the relative nature of assets and liabilities as being kind of tangible or intangible, is an interesting kind of question that one can cogitate about, particularly in the realm of economic rents, for example, which is something that interests the late Marx. And so he looked at he started sort of in his historical path about how the Enlightenment and original free market economists spent 2 centuries trying to prevent precisely the kind of rentier dominance that is stifling today's economies and rolling back democracies to create financial oligarchies. That's the current position now. Financial oligarchs, right? You got, well, like in Trump talking to Musk. I mean, two idiots talking, and you could just see the bizarreness of it all. So an Orwellian strategy of rhetorical deception to represent finance and other rentier sectors as being part of the economy, not external to it. Probably the best example is that technical glitch they had or whatever, which Musk claimed was a DDoS attack. Wasn't. It's just that they're incompetent. They've never truly built out. Well, my impression is they never fully built out the networks. And of course, firing all those people also suggests that whoever's left might, have either be less competent or have a kind of agenda with not making these things work in terms of the kind of channel existence of X/Twitter. Anyway, Orwellian strategy of rhetorical deception to represent finance and other rentier sectors as being part of the economy, not external to it. This is precisely the strategy that parasites in nature use to deceive their hosts, that they are not free riders, but part of the host's own body, deserving careful protection. So this idea of kind of a kind of free riderism, and you can see this operative in a whole variety of ecological situations. Blue jays and egg co-opting other people's nesting. All this kind of stuff occurs, and these are kind of evolutionary proofs in that sense. So the equilibrium is pretty obvious to see, I think. And so I included here a little section on parasitic wasps, which I find amusing, and there is a Rick and Morty reference here too, but I'm not going to show it just simply because you may think I'm totally an idiot about this. A parasitic wasp that paralyzes her prey, drags it to the nest, then lays her eggs in it. The paralyzed host lies in the nest while the eggs develop. Then, when the larvae hatch, they devour the still conscious host. And I like that analogy because in some ways that's the sort of codependent or transactional or exchange driven component of this. And so Dina Campos coconelli is a species of wasp, a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs in ladybirds. It gives it also a virus that turns it, God damn it, a virus that turns it into a zombie. The wasp larva consumes the non-vital organs and then emerges to pulpate. The zombie beetle protects the larvae as it spins its cocoon. So you can see this from an ecological point of view. This is a certain brand of adaptation, and of many different types. And this is the metabolic issue that why, a Marxist biology, as it were, is actually an interesting notion from a scientific point of view because it replicates certain structural elements. Then they tunnel out, make a cocoon, and use the still living beetle to be bodyguard until ready to emerge. So all of this is adaptation. It protects the larvae, and it's really quite interesting. And so Hudson has a section this is in the preface, a parasite, the host, and the control of the economy's brain. So, he tries to show that these relationships, these contiguities are really kind of important. They're not as simple as kind of questions of, free riders more specifically, but there's details to this. The whole point of usury, for example, the whole discussion of surpluses in that particular sense, and not that these are identical to human market, sort of things, but you can see that a lot of arrangements, like certain laws, certain administrative laws, are designed to support this kind of, the whole idea of interest rates is, it's a little friendlier than having someone, control your brain and use your body to pulpate stuff. On the other hand, you can see that J.D. Vance truly wants the state to know when women are menstruating. So you just want to get this little sense that there's things that are similar that are percolating. Project 2025 has a component that supports this notion. Anyway, to be sure, leeches have long been recognized as performing a useful medical function. George Washington and Stalin were treated with leeches on their deathbeds, not only because bleeding the host was thought to be a cure, much as today's monetarist view financial austerity, but also because leeches inject an anticoagulant enzyme that helps prevent inflammation and thus steers the body to recovery. So there's like truth there, sort of, and yet seems quite medieval, as we know. This is that whole deal about the pre-modern having this kind of element. The idea of parasitism as a positive symbiosis is epitomized by the term host economy, one that welcomes foreign investment. And you can see that it is you can have host-client kind of relations in terms of dependency and imperialism, the relationship between a hegemonic economy, global North, and the global South, which is still replicating and still, sort of acting in these kind of ways. So mutually beneficial symbiosis occurs, but it's clearly asymmetric. And I think it's important to note the asymmetry. Parasites require hosts, and a mutually beneficial symbiosis often results. Some parasites help their host survive by finding more food. Others protect it from disease, knowing that they will wind up as the beneficiaries of its growth. A financial analogy occurred in the 19th century when high finance and government moved closer together to fund public utilities, infrastructure, capital-intensive manufacturing, especially in armaments, shipping, and heavy industry. And yes, this is what happens when you want a big damn navy for X number of reasons, to not only protect your interests, but to kick some other country's ass, to show that you're the uh, the big person on campus. But you could say that some of the advances that were created, trickled down, as it were, in the late 19th century in England, for example, better sewage systems at all. Um, all of these things are actually kind of interesting. They cross Thames tunnel rather than building a bridge. Um, and just the idea of all the electric light and et cetera, all sorts of the same things in the Victorian period. Banking was evolving from predatory usury to take the lead in an organizing industry along the most efficient lines. And so you can see, Bismarck and his navy and a bunch of other things. What Hudson is trying to do is to show that, there's something useful in looking at these kind of structural sets of relations, um, and Templars, et cetera, so that it is a more feudal arrangement in that sense, or quasi-feudal. Um, and then this is the thing that Marx was trying to consider in the later volumes of Capital. That is, rent extraction, a variety of rent-seeking activities, the question of the motion of the system, sort of floating, the exchange relations and all that, kind of keeping it all floating and becoming problematic when seen as a kind of privatizing act. This is where the property thing becomes really, uh, the concept of property becomes problematized in this same instance, and it still is. It simply relies on certain historical anachronisms to sort of keep it moving along. Such privatization is contrary to what classical economists meant by a free market. So this is where the ideology gets, sort of explicated. They envisioned a market free from rent paid to a hereditary landlord class and free from interest and monopoly rent paid to private owners. The ideal system was a morally fair, this is the ethical question, right? The ethics of the market. And I talked about that before, social ontology and all that stuff. Morally fair market in which people would be rewarded for their labor and enterprise, but would not receive income without making a positive contribution to production and related social needs, the greater good, etc. So Smith, Ricardo, Mill, and their contemporaries warned that rent extraction threatened to siphon off income and bid up prices above the necessary cost of production. So this is this issue of costs. Their major aim was to prevent landlords from reaping where they have not sown. Towards this end, the labor theory of value aimed at deterring landlords, natural resource owners, and monopolists from charging prices above cost-value, opposing governments controlled by rentiers. And if we put Trump in office, he's sort of the rentier in that particular context. I mean, this is what Republicans do, right? They drive up deficits. That's their whole deal. Is they take advantage of the fact that Democrats probably do a much better job of trying to equalize everything, to get things to level out, and then they come in for whatever ideological reason and then go and screw it up because they don't care. They've got they've got a credit card with a sort of a big expense account, an infinite expense account. Recognizing how great fortunes have been built up in predatory ways. This is predation, right? Well, I was just talking about that, through usury, war lending, and political insider dealings to grab the commons and carve out burdensome monopoly privileges, led to a popular view of financial magnates, landlords, and hereditary ruling elite as parasitic by the 19th century, epitomized by the French anarchist Proudhon slogan, "Property is theft." And Prudhomme has other issues relative to what counts as wealth, et cetera. But at least at the front end, this property thing can be a real problem, is a real problem. It's not can be a real problem, and Proudhon, is part of the problem in that sense relative to the commune, et cetera. Instead of creating a mutually beneficial symbiosis with the economy of production and consumption, departments 1 and 2, today's financial parasitism siphons off income needed to invest and grow. Bankers and bondholders desiccate the host economy by extracting revenue to pay interest and dividends. This is the float, right? Repaying a loan, amortizing, or killing it shrinks the host. Like the word amortization, mortgage, dead hand, mortgage, of past claims for payment contains the root mort or more or death. A financialized economy becomes a mortuary when the host economy becomes a meal for the financial free luncher that takes interest, fees, and other charges without contributing to production. The great question in a financialized economy, as well as in a biological nature, is whether death of the host is a necessary consequence or whether a more positive symbiosis can be developed. Now, I think you can imagine some people just, they'll steal from you in a kind of reasonable way, or you convinced yourself that this is a good idea. The answer depends on whether the host can remain self-steering in the face of a parasitic attack. Taking control of the host's brain or government provides the basis for a more elaborate social analogy to financial strategy by describing the sophisticated strategy that parasites use to control their host by disabling their normal defense mechanisms. To be accepted, the parasite must convince the host that no attack is underway. To siphon off a free lunch without triggering resistance, the parasite needs to take control of the host's brain, at first to dull its awareness that an invader has attached itself. The pods, the pods have come. And then to make the host believe that the free rider is helping rather than depleting it and is temperate in its demands, only asking for the necessary expenses of providing its services. And those who paid attention to the people rationalizing the existence of the pods and invasion of the baddie snatchers can see that sort of operating there. In that spirit, bankers depict their interest charges as a necessary and benevolent part of the economy, providing credit to facilitate production and thus deserving to share in the surplus that helps create trickle down. Insurance companies, stockbrokers, and underwriters join bankers in aiming to erase the economy's ability to distinguish financial claims on wealth from real wealth creation. So this idea of wealth creation has become more abstracted. It's less concrete relative to comparing feudal and capitalist wealth formation, because wealth formation exists regardless of the historical period, and its reality becomes sort of altered in the shift in modes of production. Their interest charges and fees typically eat into the circular flow of payments and income between producers and consumers. To deter protective regulations to limit this incursion, high finance popularizes, promotes a value-free view that in no sector exploits any other part. Whatever creditors and their financial managers take is deemed to be fair value for the services they offer. Otherwise, bankers ask, why would people or companies pay interest if not to pay for credit deemed necessary to help the economy grow? It's the vigorish, right? It's the vig. Bankers and also their major customers, real estate, oil and mining, and monopolies, claim that whatever they are able to extract from the rest of the economy is earned just as fairly as new direct investment in industrial capital. You get what you pay for is used to justify any price, no matter how ridiculous. It is circular reasoning playing with tautologies. The most lethal policy sedative in today's mainstream orthodoxy is the mantra that all income is earned. This soporific illusion distracts attention from how the financial sector diverts the economy's nourishment to feed monopolies and rent-extracting sectors surviving from past centuries, now supplemented by yet new sources of monopoly rent, above all in the financial and money management sectors. The illusion is built into the self-portrait that today's economies draw to describe their circulation of spending and production, that is, the National Income and Products Account, the NIPA. As presently designed, NEPA neglects the distinction between productive activities and zero-sum transfer payments, where no overall production of real gain takes place, but income is paid to one party at another's expense. The NEPA duly report the revenue at the fire sector, the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, and monopolies as earnings. These accounts have no category for what classical economists called economic rent, a free lunch in the form of income siphoned off without a corresponding cost of labor or enterprise. And this is the problematic division between, a labor theory of value and something more integrated. Yet a rising proportion of what the NEPA report as earnings actually derive from such rents. So this no such thing as a free lunch is a kind of an interesting idea. It means there's no parasites. Taking without giving an equivalent value in return, at least no private sector parasites. Now, this is where the hinge for government position, only government regulation is condemned, not rent extraction. In fact, taxation of rentiers, the recipients of free lunch income, coupon clippers living off government bonds or rental properties or monopolies, is denounced rather than endorsed, as was the case for Smith Mill and their 19th century free market followers. Ricardo aimed his rent theory at Britain's landlords while remaining silent about the financial rentiers. He didn't, this is the so-called well, it relates, I think, to the single system kind of argument. Financial rentiers, the class whose activities John Maynard Keynes, remember we were talking about Keynes, and Keynes was in that film, playfully suggested that there should be euthanized. Landed proprietors, financiers, and monopolists were singled out as the most visible free lunchers, giving them the strongest motive to deny the concept and principle. So familiar parasites in today's economy include Wall Street's investment bankers and hedge fund managers who raid companies and empty out their pension reserves. Also, landlords who rack rent their tenants, that is, threatening eviction if unfair and extortionate demands are not met. And monopolists who gouge customers with prices not warranted by the actual cost of production. Commercial banks demand that government treasuries or central banks cover their losses. This is made more complicated when, modern money theory talks a little bit more about this, claiming that their credit steering activity is necessary to allocate resources and avoid economic dissolution. So here again, we find the basic rentier demand: your money or your life. A rentier economy is one in which individuals and entire sectors levy charges for the property and privileges they've attained, or more often, that their ancestors have bequeathed, as Honoré de Balzac observed. The greatest fortunes originated from thefts or insider dealings whose details are so lost in the mists of time, become legitimately the force of social inertia. At the root of such parasitism is the idea of rent extraction, taking without producing, permitting an excess of market price to be charged over intrinsic cost value, lets landlords, monopolists, and bankers charge more for access to land, natural resources, monopolies, and credit than their services really need to cost. Unreformed economies are obliged to carry what 19th century journalists called the idle rich, 20th century writers called robber barons and the power elite, and Occupy Wall Street called the one percenters. To prevent such socially destructive exploitation, most nations have regulated and taxed rentier activities or kept such potential activities, above all basic infrastructure, in the public domain. Basic infrastructure including, water, power, whatever. But regulatory oversight has been systematically disabled in recent years. Throwing off the taxes and regulation put in place over the past 2 centuries, the wealthiest 1% have captured nearly all the growth in income since the 2008 crash. Holding the rest of society in debt to themselves, they have used their wealth and creditor claims to gain control of the election process and governments by supporting lawmakers who untax them, that big tax cut, and judges or court systems that refrain from prosecuting them. Obliterating the logic that led society to regulate and tax rentiers in the first place, think tanks and business schools favor economists who portray rentier takings as a contribution, as a contribution to the economy rather than as a subtrahend from it. History shows a universal tendency for rent extracting conquerors, colonizers, or privileged insiders to take control and siphon off the fruits of labor and industry for themselves. Bankers and bondholders demand interest, landlords and resource appropriators levy rents, and monopolists engage in price gouging. The result is a rentier-controlled economy that imposes austerity on the population. It is the worst of all worlds. Even while starving economies, economic rent charges render them high cost by widening the margin of prices over intrinsic socially necessary costs of production and distribution, reversing classical reform since World War II, and especially since 1980, the great reversal of classical industrial era reform ideology to regulate or tax away rentier income occurred after World War I. Bankers came to see their major market to be real estate, mineral rights, and monopolies, lending mainly to finance the purchase and sale of these rent-extracting opportunities in these sectors. Banks lent against what buyers of land, mines, and monopolies could squeeze out of their rent-extracting toll booth opportunities. The effect was to pry away the land rent and natural resource rent that classical economists, sort of expected. And, this is the building of the resource curse. But anyway, expected to serve as a natural tax base. In industry, Wall Street became the mother of trusts, creating mergers into monopolies as vehicles to extract monopoly rent. Precisely because a free lunch, that is rent, was free, if governments did not tax it away, speculators and other buyers sought to borrow to buy such rent-extracting privileges. Instead of a classical free market ideal in which rent was paid as taxes, the free lunch was financialized, that is, capitalized into bank loans to be paid out as interest or dividends. Note, of course, this is, there's time shifts in here, et cetera. So, what you would think would be a market that clears would never happen. Banks gained at the expense of the tax collector. By 2012, over 60% of the value of today's homes in the United States is owed to creditors, so that most rental value is paid as interest to banks, not to the community. Home ownership has been democratized on credit. Yet banks have succeeded in promoting the illusion that the government is the predator, not the bankers. This is clearly an ideological thing. The rising proportion of owner-occupied housing has made the real estate tax the most unpopular of all taxes, as if property tax cuts do not simply leave more rental income available to pay mortgage lenders. The result of a tax shift off of property is a rising mortgage debt by home buyers paying access prices bid up on bank credit. Popular morality blames victims for going into debt, not only individuals, but also national governments. The trick in this ideological war is to convince debtors to imagine that general prosperity depends on paying bankers and making bondholders rich, a veritable Stockholm syndrome in which debtors identify with their financial captors. Today's policy fight is largely over the illusion of who bears the burden of taxes and bank credit. The underlying issue is whether the economy's prosperity flows from the financial sector's credit and debt creation or is being bled by increasingly predatory finance. So just to pose it in that way gives us all that parasitic stuff. So I should stop right there. But, I would assert that, some of this, I leave the rest for you to read, and let's skip to the themes. There's all kinds of other issues that are built under this. Here we go. Come on. There are 12 themes in this book, and we could tackle them. I think they're worth tackling. This book is not so technical, lots of math and blah, blah, blah. Nation's destiny is shaped by two sets of economic relationships. Most textbooks and mainstream economists focus on the real economy of production and consumption based on the employment of labor, tangible means of production, and technological potential. This tangible Economy number one is wrapped in a legal and institutional framework of credit and debt, property relations, and ownership privileges, while economy number two is centered on the finance, insurance, and real estate, the FIRE sector. This debt and ownership economy transforms its economic gains into political control to enforce payments of debt and to preserve property and natural resource or monopoly rent privileges, typically inherited. Interest and rents are transfer payments from economy one to economy two, but mainstream economics depicts all income as being earned productively, even by absentee landlords and Wall Street speculators receiving rentier overhead and interest. The operative fiction is the assumption that everyone earns in proportion to what they contribute to production. NEPA treats whatever revenue these individuals are able to extract as a contribution to GDP as if their exorbitant incomes reflect high productivity. This is that CEO, income stuff. Their output is defined as equal to the revenue. So GDP should really be thought of as gross national cost. There seems to be no such thing as economic parasitism. Certainly, that's not a category, or unnecessary costs of living and doing business. No free lunch is recognized, and hence no economy two that does not contribute productively to economy number one. Theme number two, today's banks don't finance tangible investment in factories, new means of production, or research and development, the productive lending that is supposed to provide borrowers with the means to pay off their debt. Banks largely lend against collateral already in place, mainly real estate, 80% of bank loans, stocks and bonds. The effect is to transfer ownership of these assets, not produce more. Theme number three, borrowers use these loans to bid up prices for the assets they buy on credit. Homes and office buildings, entire companies buy debt leveraged buyouts and infrastructure in the public domain on which to install toll booths and charge access rents. Lending against such assets bids up their prices. This is asset price inflation. Paying off these loans with interest leaves less wage or profit income available to spend on consumer goods or capital goods. This debt deflation is the inevitable successor to asset price inflation. So this is the sequence. Debt service and rent charge shrink markets, consumer spending, employment, and wages. Austerity makes it harder to pay debts. This is number five. By shrinking markets and causing unemployment. This is why Keynes urged the euthanasia of the rentier. If industrial capitalism is to thrive, he hoped to shift the focus from fortune seeking away from banking and implicitly from its major loan markets and absentee landlordship and privatization of rent extracting monopolies. Mainstream policy, number six, pretends that economies are able to pay their debts without reducing their living standards or losing property, but debts grow exponentially faster than the economy's ability to pay as interest accrues and is recycled. That is, while new bank credit is created electronically. The magic of compound interest doubles and redoubles savings and debt balances by purely mathematical laws that are independent of the economy's ability to produce and pay. Economies become more debt leveraged as claims for payment are concentrated in the hands of that 1%. Debts that can't be paid won't be. The question is, how won't they be paid? And there are two ways not to pay. The most drastic and disruptive way, euphemized as business as usual, is for individuals, companies, or governments to sell off or forfeit their assets. The second way to resolve matters is to write down debts to a level that can be paid. Bankers and bondholders prefer the former option and insist that all debts can be paid given the will to do so. That is, the will to transfer property into their hands. This is the solution that mainstream monetarist economists, government policy, and the mass media popularize as basic morality. But it destroys economy number one to enrich the 1% who dominate economy number two. Number eight, a bubble economy may postpone the collapse as banks lend on easier terms. I won't. Number nine, banks and bondholders oppose debt write-downs to bring debt in line with earnings and historical asset valuations. This is the kind of problems that you can see built into the system. Number 10, the financial sector backs oligarchs. oligarchies. This is all the thing and then you've got, kind of monkey business going on, and this kind of what the problems of the EU and Brexit and blah, 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 all these other kind of crazy activities, like with Greece and Italy. Every economy is planned. The big question is who does the damn planning? This is an agency question as well. And you can see that in the American government, with the kind of revolving door of Goldman Sachs, et cetera, this is incredibly problematized. And number 12, the financial sector's drive to increase its political power has a fatal fiscal dimension. Whatever economic rent that remains untaxed is free to be pledged to the banks as interest. Banks therefore advocate untaxing real estate, natural resource rent, and monopoly price gouging. This is the opposite from the classical policy of taxing and deprivatizing economic rent and asset price gains. Classical value and price theory demonstrates that a rent tax does not increase tax prices, but is paid out of rent. This is the Ricardian thing, absorbing the excess of price over intrinsic cost value. That was the policy aim of free market economists from the physiocrats and Adam Smith through John Stuart Mill in the Progressive Era. By the late 19th century, it was called socialism, which originally meant freeing markets from the political legacy of feudal privileges to enclose the commons and privatize public infrastructure. So you can see current crap going on. Now, if you want to see something that this was just put up a day ago, Michael Hudson, as he has aged, because I think he's in his late 70s, 80s, he's talking more apocalyptically about economic collapse and the end of civilization. It's a podcast. So if you want to hear him actually rant about this stuff, that's kind of interesting. Okay. I have yacked far too much, and I hope you learned something. We'll continue with a slight discussion. If there's at some moment, we will kill the live stream so we can say nasty words. So yes, long story short, the game is rigged. Indeed. Uh, Lane is split because of he's sleepy. Warren, I'm sure you have a position on this whole business.
Yes, well, I think it's really interesting. Like one of the things that he sort of touches on is like they use philanthropy to try to wash the reputation. It's
Oh yes,
so that's just an added thing.
but that's been
Um,
there. That's been there for centuries.
well, yes, but his debt jubilee dates all the way back to Hammurabi. That's where the idea came from.
Indeed.
Like Steve Keen also has the modern day debt jubilee plan all ready to go, and how to come about doing it. Also, like the American Monetary Institute out of Chicago has that debt free money idea to try to combat this stuff. But at the same time, he doesn't really touch on it. But the you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. That's the basis of basically all the economies is basically growth. The economy will keep on growing. You can't
Yep.
do that on a finite planet. And yet they seem to think like, oh, we'll come up with a technological solution to fix that. I was like, no, that doesn't work.
Yep.
So at the end of the day, we have to remember that Mother Nature bats last and she wins every time.
Indeed, she will win.
So yeah, so
Well,
it's
Or
that's
the,
only
or the
true,
giant
Warren.
meteor.
That's only true, Warren, if you believe in the laws of physics.
well, John, I guess you're saying that you don't believe in the laws of physics. Oh, it's yes.
So Steve Keen has a plan for
Lot
Jubilee? How would that work?
you'd have to go out to his website and look at the plan. He's got it up on his website, but I think
Uh,
I don't know if he won his seat in the Australian Parliament, but he was running for it.
Yeah, he
So
was. I don't think he got it though.
I don't think so
I
either.
don't know.
But he's a Minsky guy and a disciple of Hudson's. They're friends. So yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, Hudson's quite old. He's got to be approaching 90 at this point.
Uh,
90, really?
30.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
born in 39 or
I think it's
38
earlier than that, maybe, or 38,
or something like
something
that.
like that.
Whatever.
So yeah, but yeah,
Uh,
he's really brilliant. Yeah, they all have their own quirks, like all these radical economists. Like he would always wax poetically about how back in the 60s there was all these Marxist economists that went to Wall Street because they understand the labor theory of value. So they would make really good money for like Chase Manhattan and all these big Wall Street banks back in the 60s when they were blacklisted from the
Yep.
McCarthy hearings. So yeah, you
I
you
mean,
look
that's
you look at Wolf's son, for crying out loud.
oh,
He sells his research to hedge funds.
yep.
So as we said, the game is most definitely rigged. It's like how do you
Oh yeah.
how do you how do you combat that? That's the real question. It's like how
Well,
do you implement?
creating well, this is that deal about, you have to create niches in a socialist economy where you're going to do some of this stuff. But and I think it can be done actually. You create, certain autonomous zones or whatever. The Chinese did that during the Cultural Revolution. The science and banking were sacrosanct during the Cultural Revolution. It is, in fact, how they managed to survive the damn Cultural Revolution.
Who's this podcast that he's on? The Is
I
that
don't know,
Daniel Denver or something like that?
something like that. I don't
Something
know.
like that. Yeah, he's very smart.
Hmm.
so why does Hudson think there's going to be economic collapse? Is it because of all the debts that's been accumulating?
Yeah, yeah. It's just the fact is, it's just teetering.
Well, it's like
It,
a
It's just that he's not talking about climate crisis, but in fact, it is kind of driven by climate crisis.
well, and the behavior or whatever the thing that the rentiers are doing just makes it leverages it even more. So it like it ratchets it towards some sort of crisis.
Yep.
is Lane here? Lane, could you put me down against economic collapse, please? One again, one against.
I think Lane went to bed.
Oh, all right. I'll have to write it down myself then.
Well, there's got to be like policies and like propaganda that makes this parasitism, not seem like them being parasites, right?
Yeah.
Is that through, I mean, part of it I think is, average Joe's propensity to be a libertarian and think he's,
Freedom. Freedom.
somehow, yeah. But there's also, like economic policy, that sort of thing. Um, that I mean that at some point I guess it comes from written stuff like uh, Smith and Ricardo and whatever that third guy was.
Mills, John Stuart Mill.
Right, but I mean it's like where does that happen? I don't. I'm sort of fuzzy on where that might take place.
Well, academics not not as driven by often even Marxists by their you know fervor, revolutionary fervor. So, I mean, after all, Larry Summers is still alive.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. So like guys like Greenspan are
Oh,
the ones who are
right.
doing this shit, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And they're sort of sub agents, right? I'm sure that Kissinger left
Right. So they got a bunch of
to
henchmen,
his
right? A
estate.
bunch of bag guys or whatever.
Yes, that's right, Bagman. And they do this with impunity, right? And
Till
they
they
then,
get caught. Yeah.
oh, yeah,
Which rarely happens.
Steve Mnuchin trying to buy TikTok, whatever. There's just all this crap out there, aside from, Musk and at all. I
Well,
mean,
who was
an
that?
antitrust action again. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, who's that guy? Like Greenspan, wasn't he associated with some guy who did time, kind of, and then Greenspan came away like,
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I think so.
Well, he was associated with Ayn Rand.
Hey, he dated her.
He dated her. Oh God, is that an image?
There's pictures of him escorting her to things.
Um,
Ugh. Anyone else?
so did you
Comments?
say
Rick,
did you say that Michael Hudson is a Trotskyist?
he was raised as a Trotskyist. His parents were Trotskyists.
Okay, but is he?
No, he's not a Trotskyist.
Okay.
But I would assert that I think you can't be raised by Trotskyists without having some political consciousness about, you know, the need to think about global things or international things. That's all.
Yeah, so that's a good thing in that
Yeah.
sense.
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, the fracture between Trotsky and Stalin, is just it's just constrained by history or whatever. That, Stalin was a psycho, whatever.
So, Anne, a lot of people giving Stalin a hard time. And I mean, if you look at his funeral, people were really upset that he died. And, I think there was like people were trampled. If they didn't really like Stalin, you wouldn't get trampling at a funeral. That's how I read it.
There still is a cult of Stalin in Russia.
Oh yeah.
Well, just like there's a cult of Mao, that sort of dissipated and then but has come back like every 10 years. I think you get, sort of little blips of cults of Mao.
Oh, so it's kind of like the cicadas.
Yes, yes. I think you can eat cicadas, but I haven't seen one and certainly haven't. But it's my understanding you can actually eat cicadas.
Yeah. Well, I won't be testing that hypothesis.
Bug protein.
So if this economic collapse happens, that's not going to have an adverse effect on 401ks, is it? I
Well,
think a lot of people wouldn't like it.
it's not so much relying on sort of cyclical kind of issues or even long waves or whatever. But collapse is, with respect, is kind of inevitable. It's just that it's not. It, we've managed to evade it at various moments in the economy. 2008. The stuff kicked in and managed to keep the damn corpse alive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if our central bank is big enough to absorb all the bad debt next time, maybe we should make it an even like a global central bank that would be able to handle it. So we can
Wouldn't
What
that
do
just
you
be
keep.
think the
nice?
Bank of International Settlements is, John?
Indeed,
Come
that
on.
is the bank. That is the bank.
So is that
Anna,
capable
Anna,
of handling this stuff?
Anna, can you tell him, please?
Yes.
No, sorry, I've never been inside.
I know you haven't. They don't let anybody inside.
No,
That doesn't belong there.
The BIS.
no. I was had the chance to go inside and I had to cancel my appointment.
Oh, oh, come on, Anna. I would have paid you a lot of money to do that one.
Maybe next year.
Okay.
They don't give souvenirs. Jesus.
Yeah, but
Oh
I
my.
see the tower from my balcony right now.
Thank you, Anna.
There we go. No, truly. I mean, if you could actually integrate the system better, without having these relative autonomies. I mean, you can argue that this is what keeps everything going, is that they kind of exist with little autonomy of these little things, just like the money laundering is done by some regional deal. So on the one hand, the bureaucracy, sort of keeps it alive. On the other hand, there's all this corrupt crap going on.
Just like Fela Kuti was singing about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Is my understanding is like, after 2008, the bailout like basically doubled American debt.
Well, just remember,
Yes.
And
Larry, we issue our own currency, so we're never running out of money.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. But I was wondering how that might, filter out to pressure on, that debt be kind of pushed on to other people somehow,
Yes.
other than the
Well,
United States, because the United States position kind of at the top of the heap.
well, it's good to be the king.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
good to be global reserve currency also.
Right.
yeah.
That helps tremendously.
But that's being
Indeed.
challenged.
That's being challenged even more
Indeed it
so.
is.
But until Russia withdraws from the Ukraine, they'll never win because
Yeah,
that's
that
one of
ain't
the
happening.
things.
Because what?
Because of the Russia in Ukraine, like that they're part of the BRICS.
Mm-hmm.
And the ruble is in trouble. And you've got, there's all kinds of crap going on.
What is this a recent development? The ruble is
Yes.
losing
This is a
value.
6 time, what is it? I don't know. I put it up in coast. And, there's stuff's happening. And there's other issues about, the whole question of the oil stuff being sold and whatever, Russian oil being sold, and then I think Austria. I think they're trying to the Russians are trying to cut off the natural gas to Austria or something. There's just other crap going on.
Oligarchs got an oligarch, right?
Indeed. Indeed.
No one can accuse them of being lazy.
Well, as long as they got their dupes out there doing shit for them, doing stuff for them. Put it that way.
Which is worse, a dupe or a bagman?
Useful idiots. Useful idiots. Well, I've achieved the end of my yammering, so let me see if I can, or if Joe wants to shut off the
Thank you.